In a previous discussion, we were talking about the distinction between traditional resistance movements and modern politics. The traditional resistance movements, as you are aware, were organized predominantly by the rural classes, and modern politics was characterized by the rise of associations. The Congress represented the climax of the early trends towards association-based politics in the later half of the 19th century, in the sense that the Congress was the symbol of what historians have described as the politics of national unity, symbolizing the ability on the part of the Indian political leadership to outgrow their provincial moorings and come together in an attempt to create a national political outfit to be able to contain the power of British rule. Now, this particular discussion will concentrate on the larger context in which the Congress had emerged. Through the political experience of the Indian intelligentsia in the course of the decades of 1860s and 1870s. The early 1880s was a time when the political leadership, essentially provincial in nature at that stage, increasingly felt the need for a national body. What the significance of this event was in the long term will be taken up, of course, later. But I am reminded of a very interesting statement made by one of the newspapermen when the Indian leaders had assembled to give a kind of a hearty send-off to Ripon when he went back from India to Britain. They saw the kind of mobilization, and one of them had commented, "If this is true, what does it mean?" So the situation in the early 1880s was such that people were longing for this kind of an organization. I mean, those who were involved in provincial politics were looking for the creation of this kind of an organization. Historical explanations for the rise of the Congress, the foundation of the Congress in 1885, usually call attention to the experience that I am talking about, the experience of the rise of a public sphere, the experience of the provincial bodies that had been formed since 1850s. But there are certain arguments which need to be sorted out at the very early part of this discussion.
What is this public sphere and how is it constituted?
You know, the term public sphere would obviously imply a kind of activity which is relatively open, which happens in the presence of the public view it, participate in it, read the literature that this kind of activity actually produces. The term public sphere was employed by historians of the French Revolution who found in the activities of the many different clubs that actually contributed to the revolutionary movement on the eve of the Great French Revolution of 1789 as some of the major evidences of how the public sphere had emerged. If you actually try to define public sphere in more concrete terms, you have to talk about the expansion of the print media, for example. The print media by 1870s had expanded quite substantially. The vernacular newspapers had begun to be published in large number from the small towns. And what was even more important was that these vernacular newspapers were actually carrying new information with which the local context always was not associated. I mean, even small town newspapers were carrying information about distant places. Say, for example, the cotton duties controversy in the 1890s. I talked about cotton duties controversy earlier. When the government decided to impose an excise tax on locally produced cotton, the vernacular newspapers were reporting this and commenting on this decision in negative terms. This is the way one can actually grasp how the expansion of the print media, the publication of the vernacular newspapers in large number, the ability on the part of the vernacular newspapers, which were basically produced locally, to carry information of national importance, all these actually contributed to the emergence of a nationalist public sphere. For example, a person who is publishing a newspaper in a small district in Bengal, if that newspaper carried information about how the textile mills were actually trying to establish their strongholds in Western India against many obstacles created by imperial rule, and therefore imperial rule deserved to be condemned, it is a clear indication of how a certain degree of national consensus had begun to emerge on certain critical issues. Issues of political representation, issues concerning Indianization of services, issues concerning the need for India's industrial development, all these were emerging as important national issues on which a certain degree of consensus had begun to emerge, and they were reflected in the print media. It was through the print media that people living in disparate regions were able to establish a certain kind of communication with one another. The importance of the print media in making nations where nations didn't exist has been recognized by great scholars like Benedict Anderson, for example. In his famous book, Imagine Communities, he has put great emphasis on the role of the print media in creating a nationalist public sphere. But at the same time, one would imagine that apart from the print media, the associations which were being formed at different levels in the provinces also played a critical role. But before we come to this question, it may be important for us to sort out some of the myths which surround the history of the emergence of the Congress, which to some extent are contradicted by the historical explanation of the emergence of the Congress as a climax of certain changes in Indian political and social life that had been going on for some time, at least for a couple of decades. The rise of the public sphere is one of those important attributes, but there should be other explanations as well, which should focus on association. With these myths you are familiar. People said that the Congress was created as a kind of a safety valve, that there were grievances and the government felt that they could actually, by acting through a man like Alan Octavian Hume, who had been serving as the Secretary of the Congress in its early years for some time, that through Alan Octavian Hume they would be able to create an organization which would channelize grievances through the constitutional channels. That is the basis of a safety valve theory, which sees the Congress as a kind of a command performance performed by a man like Hume in consultation with the bureaucracy. One of the admirers of Hume, Wedderburn, actually went to the extent of suggesting that Hume saw some papers at Simla which were actually giving him a sense of how another rebellion was imminent. So Hume felt the urgency to create an organization, and he consulted the officials of the government and decided to float the Indian National Congress. We acknowledge the very important contribution that Alan Octavian Hume made to the emergence of the Congress, but so some of these theories which actually try to link the Congress with a certain kind of command performance have reduced the story to the level of detective fictions. These are not actually valid arguments or valid explanations. So for the more reasonable explanations for the rise of the Congress, we have to return to the kind of political experience that the Indian intelligentsia had been undergoing during the 1870s and early 1880s, or perhaps from 1850s onwards. They were experimenting with provincial level organizations. A public sphere was expanding, animated by the print media. So this is the larger context in which you have to actually locate the processes or the stages through which the Congress had emerged in 1885 as a national body, but certainly as a continuation of some of the trends that had already been noticed in Indian politics in the earlier couple of decades. This brings us to the other dimension of the story, that the Indian intelligentsia increasingly felt that if India was not a nation, India was a nation in making. So that is the celebrated title of the famous book by Surendranath Banerjee, one of the great early nationalist leaders, whose autobiography, A Nation in Making, suggested that through the growing communications between different regions, a sense of national identity was slowly emerging.
Sir, wasn't it difficult for the Indian intelligentsia to